My name's Mark Hill. I'm the Climate and Sustainability Lead, I say, here at TPR. And I'd like to start by welcoming you all to TPR's joint webinar with the IMF FSAP team, and to thank you for all your participation in last year's OPS DB Asset Allocation Survey. Thank you ever so much for taking part in that. The aim of the webinar today is to present you with the findings from the climate research analysis that the IMF FSAP team carried out as part of the assessment of financial stability conditions in the UK, otherwise referred to as the FSAP 2021-22, as well as give you an opportunity to submit questions to our industry panel later on in the webinar. The session today will last about 2 hours with 2 planned Q&A sessions. I'll run through the agenda in a moment, but first I'd like to start by going through some housekeeping, if I may. Today's session will be recorded, so for those colleagues who are unable to attend, please let them know we will be in contact via email to all the schemes who participated in the survey, and that will include a link to access this content again. You should receive this in a few days' time. Also, please be aware that the recording is intended for a wider audience, including those who may not be as far along the journey. So I say, please bear that in mind. As this is a Teams webinar, please stay on mute and turn your camera off. That will help us greatly. I say we have tried to enforce that, but with the vagaries of Teams, it may not work for all of you. So if you could do that, I'd be most grateful. You will be able to access the chat. You'll be unable to access the chat function, but don't worry. I say we really want to hear from you. We really want those questions. So please submit your questions to the panel via the Slido app. And I say you will find the code for that on various slides as we go through, but also on the invite. So to do this, simply hold your smartphone up to the QR code as shown here on the slide, go to your camera function, take the photo, or if you don't have a phone, type in the web address slido.com and use the event code hashtag TPR20June in uppercase. So this should automatically log you into the Slido app, where you can begin to submit your questions. These can be named or anonymous. It's entirely up to you. I say we very much leave that with you. Slido also gives you the option of voting for your favorite questions. So just put a thumbs up using the thumbs up icon. And I said that will greatly help us as well. Thank you. So today you'll be hearing from David Fairs, our Executive Director of Regulatory Policy Analysis and Advice, who will introduce the session. He'll be coming live from Paris. So I say I've still got my fingers crossed. I'll then hand you over to Udaibir, Advisor and Assistant Director for the FSAP and FSAP Mission Chief at the IMF, and Pierpaolo Grippa, Senior Economist and member of the FSAP team at the IMF, who will present their findings from the climate study focusing on the logic of the climate Minsky moment, scenarios and model expansion with the results and conditions. This will be an opportunity, say, to ask questions to Udaibir and Pierpaolo towards the end of their session by using the Slido app. So we'll then be moving on to Chris Faint, head of the Bank of England's Climate Hub, who will then take the helm to talk through the Bank of England's 2021 Climate Biennial Exploratory Scenario results. We'll then finish the session with an industry panel, question and answers, which I'm delighted to be hosting. Joining us in the panel will be Mike Clark, Founder Director at Ario Advisory, and Kerry Perkins, Head of Capital Markets Accounting for Sustainability, along with David Fairs, I say, and Chris Faint. I'll now hand you over to David Fairs to start the proceedings. The floor is yours, David.
Thank you very much, Mark, and I'll apologise in advance if there is some noise around me. I'm at the OECD, where we're talking about pensions for CDC schemes for those underprivileged, and as well as climate change. And of course, climate change has the potential to be a major systemic risk with far-reaching consequences throughout the financial system, and that's very much why we've gathered all the people that we have today. I think it is fair to say that all of us, including the speakers, are on a climate journey, And we recognize that all of us are dealing with imperfect data, models, which too are imperfect, but I expect will develop rapidly over coming years. I think we have to recognize as well that managing sharp adjustments, corrections to valuations is never easy, and it's better to understand what those challenges might be, to anticipate them, and to build resilience ahead of time. As I said, I think we've all made progress. The fact that government and regulators and major institutions are all working together is a major step forward, but we have to recognize we've got much further to go. We were absolutely delighted when the IMF was carrying out its financial sector assessment program, wanted to look at the impact of climate change on pension schemes. We were very grateful to all those participants who fed in their data into the exercise. We think this is a really important piece of work, and that's why we agreed to support the IMF in gathering the data so that they could carry out the analysis. And we're very grateful, as I say, to you for doing that. In the UK, we're in a privileged place of having TCFD imposed on pension schemes ahead of many other countries in the world. And I think that does mean that actually investors are now beginning to apply greater scrutiny, examine the impact of climate change in a way that they never have before. But as you know, those requirements are not going to stay there. There'll be further developments around sustainable disclosure requirements coming forward. And so there's yet further change on their way. But I think equally, we've got to recognize that climate change is a significant risk. It's potentially a major systemic risk, but it's not the only risk that is facing pension schemes. There are many others to come. And obviously, the situation in Europe is just one of those. But I think equally, we've got to remember that there are some downside risks, but there are also some opportunities that climate change is going to present to us. And we need to look at those in the round. I'm not going to say very much more. We've got a fantastic array of speakers lined up for you. I'm probably as interested and fascinated as you are to hear the words from Udaibir and Pierpaolo on their analysis, and from Chris on the work that the Bank of England have been doing. So Mark, back to you.
Thank you very much, David. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Udaibir Daz, Assistant Director, FSAP Mission Chief at the IMF, and Pierpaolo Grippa, the Senior Economist in the Financial Assessment and Policies Division of the IMF's Monetary and Capital Markets Department, who will take us into the next session. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. This is a good morning from Washington. And thank you, David, and our TPR colleagues for your engagement during the FSAP. It's highly appreciated, and what an honor. I think this seminar is one more example of the UK taking on what we like to call, or my team called, the global intellectual leadership in a nascent area of international significance. And we hope that our engagement with you continues beyond the seminar. The plan is really that I'll make a few overarching observations, and then Pierpaolo will come in and get into the weeds. He did most of the work. So the recently concluded FSAP was what I like to call the first chapter in the new history of the UK as an independent sovereign on financial sector and financial system policies. And this is a pretty major development, because it's almost, about 30 or over years that UK sort of on its own is determining what it wants to do and where it wants to go. In that context, this FSAP that I led assumes significance, and we not only went into the traditional policy questions relevant for financial stability, but we also stepped into the new frontiers that could becoming or are becoming material for financial stability in the UK, and obviously for the future of the city. Topics like open banking, digital money, cyber risks, and of course, climate, where we focused on banks, insurers, and a select group of funds with your help. A few things about how we are seeing things from here, sort of a global picture that I thought you probably know all of it. David, you're sitting in the OECD, but I think it's just probably a reaffirmation of things that you all know. We are seeing a substantial interest by central banks and regulators on what I call a spectrum of what we can call climate finance, which has got three blocks. One is the greening of markets and balance sheets. Second is climate-related financial risks. And third is really the resilience to climate risks and climate change, where the utility of stress testing comes in. And quite frankly, in my over 3 decades of work, I have really found a policy area that has grown so rapidly, with which the strategic importance of climate finance has been growing in the last 18 to 20 months. Now, we all agree on the need for rapid action on climate change, but several IMF member countries, as you know, are questioning the large investment needs for mitigation and adaptation. Several ideas are on the table in the policy discussions, including utilizing climate finance mechanisms that allow the public sector to leverage its fiscal capacity and mobilize private sector participation for co-investments and partnerships. Climate policymakers are understanding the critical importance of enlisting and co-opting the financial system to address some of the international or the global needs via sustainable financial ecosystem, and obviously the whole notion of resilience. You are aware of the massive work that is going on at a global level on the development of the information architecture, the taxonomies, the disclosures, the data, and of course, the greater use of stress testing. Now, in our discussions around financial stability risks, and I'm not just talking here about the banks, but the system as a whole, there is also a recognition stronger than before for regulatory guidance and risk assessments of the system, which includes banks, insurers, and all the subcomponents. And the need in this regard of coordinated development of the information architecture as a crucial policy goal. And this is being really emphasized by a lot of countries now, given the large variation of initial conditions and the very terrible risk of market fragmentation that we are witnessing almost on a daily basis. So with this sort of, in this sort of brief context, where the IMF has come out is to see 4 policy priorities. Our focus on getting into climate is very much focused around macro criticality and from the angle of macro financial channels. So while so many people are working on climate, just want to make this point clear, that the IMF's presence in this is to raise the awareness, get into the broader sectors of the financial system, the climate more broadly, but keep a very strong focus on these 2 elements of macro and macro financial. Now, in that context, there are 4 policy priorities we are pursuing. First is the need for a strong common effort between the public and the private sectors to risk share and leverage funding towards the large investment needs of climate change. The second is this whole information architecture or the universe that is absent and is coming in the way of any systematic, regular risk analyses. And I think this is also something that comes from the fact that we do want to ease the barriers of entry to firms, whether they're primary participants or the derivatives of them, and support and assist them as they go forward. The third is, of course, the whole issue of regulation and how to adjust the needs of climate finance to reduce what gets called these days as greenwashing, and to somehow see that at a global level, apples are apples, and we are comparing like with like. And the fourth area where the IMF is getting into is the whole issue of monetary policy and central banking operations, because we feel that this also has a role in creating a more climate-friendly ecosystem for the financial industry. So in all this, the stress test as a tool that Pierpaolo will tell you has a vital role. We are playing a small but an important part. And we are now doing this almost in the case of all countries, whenever we go for either an annual or a biannual policy surveillance discussion or an FSAP. Climate is now becoming an embedded part of those discussions. So I think in general, we are seeing a pretty much a heightening because the IMF has got into it and asking a few questions. We have also just estimated that the world needs almost $3.3 trillion a year in green investments going forward. So a lot of risk work, a lot of prioritization, a lot of learning. In fact, we have a note that is going to come out, which Pierpaolo, I think we should share with TPR colleagues, on what is our analytical approach that we have developed out of a few pilots that we have done, including the case of UK. And this hopefully will be a contribution to the international community and different stakeholders. So to conclude, I think in the case of UK, we went beyond with the help of the Bank of England, FCA, and TPR. We went beyond the banking industry. I think we learned a lot of lessons. In our approach, as you will hear from Pierpaolo, we have started first to add the complex climate analytics into the standard bank stress testing framework we have been using in the FSAPs for almost 25 years. Whether or not it stands the test of time, we'll see, but that was the platform that is well established and we just are building on it. And I'm certain that it'll get changed as we go forward. We are testing a focus on shorter term horizons. Most of the work that we are seeing is coming out in scenarios that are longer end. But I think what the IMF is generally worried about is what might happen tomorrow morning. So the implications of sudden shifts, given the high degree of uncertainty compounded of very long horizons, and the need for granular focus on geographical and sectoral exposures, I think that's where we are trying to go so that it complements the tremendous work that is being done already on longer term, longer in horizons. Finally, there are three practical things with which I'd like to conclude. I think some that David mentioned. We all are encountering three gaps at a global level. Of course, the data gap that David mentioned. The skills gap is the second. And the third is cross-border and cross-sectoral cooperation gaps. There is a deficit in all the three areas. And I think from the IMF side, my own view, and the point that we stressed with the UK authorities that they welcomed, is that these three deficits have to be somehow filled up. Otherwise, all the good modeling on analytics and modeling will just not work, and policy response will suffer. So now let's turn to Pierpaolo. I just want to say one final thing. This is a very small contribution of the IMF, very humble. Our approach is to learn by doing and thus to transfer the know-how to all of you. And I'm certain that your discussions will be informed by what you're about to hear. And obviously, we'll also learn from you as we end. Pierpaolo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Udaibir. When we started with this assessment, these were the questions we had in our minds as regards climate-related risks in the UK financial system. So what are the most starting from the most general one is what are the implications of climate change for financial stability, if there are implications of this. Let me remind you the FSAP stands for Financial Sector Assessment Program, and the main output is the financial sector stability assessment. So clearly, financial stability is what the IMF looks at in these assessments. How can we reconcile the very long horizons of climate-related risk with the typically nearer-term horizons of financial stability assessment? As Udaibir was mentioning, this was a very important question for us. We performed this analysis of financial stability, and I mean, it's easier to imagine financial stability as a problem in the next few years than in the next few decades, because of course the whole financial system is bound to change over decades. So it's less immediately evident that financial stability can be captured over horizon so long. And also another characteristic is that in countries like the UK, which are considered systemically important, we tend to return every 5 years for an assessment. So also this in a way uh, um, uh, leads us to look more at the nearer term horizon. Um, we wanted to understand when we can assume transition and physical risk, climate-related transition, physical risk likely to materialize. How different industry would react to sudden transition shock, because we focus mainly on transition risk. And finally, what could be the impact of a sudden shock on UK financial institutions? And here, I want to say a big thank to the pensions regulator, because when we reach out to TPR, we with this idea of involving also some pension funds, we found a very receptive response, and this allowed us to expand into an area that I think is extremely important for climate-related risks. This is the outline of the presentation. So a short introduction to what is the state of the art in climate risk analysis. Also a mention of how the UK FSAP assessment relates to the Climate Biennial Exploratory Scenario of the Bank of England, which was running more or less at the same time and got published shortly after. And then some characteristics of the main exercise, which focuses on the transition risk of corporate exposures. So exposures to corporates in loan, equity, and bond portfolios. And finally, the conclusions. The state of the art. So in 2021, there was a report by the Network for Greening the Financial Sector, which is a forum of international central banks and financial regulators, that found that modern central banks and regulators had already adopted scenario analysis to better understand the macroeconomic and financial impacts of climate change. This was in different forms in terms of top-down to bottom-up and other characteristics of the exercises. Among the exercises that were in progress at the time in 2021, there was also the Climate Biennial Exploratory Scenario of the Bank of England. Now, as I say, a bit of a comparison in terms of a general approach between the assessment we made and that of the Bank of England. So our assessment is completely top-down. This means that we have basically we have just asked for the data on the exposures of financial institutions, and in the case of the insurers and banks, we use basically the regular submissions done by the supervised entities. While in the case of the Climate Biennial Exploratory Scenario, as Chris Fink will explain better later on, this was a bottom-up exercise where the Bank of England designed the scenarios, gave methodological guidance, but the actual calculation estimations were run by the banks insurers themselves. We focused mainly on transition risk, while the exercise of the Bank of England was on both physical and transition risk. There is an asterisk here because we did some sensitivity analysis for physical risk, but our main scenario-based analysis was on transition risk. We looked at the nearer term, as I was saying before. This was very important for us. So basically, we looked at, we started in 2020, so we looked at the horizon up to 2025, while the Bank of England looked at very long-term horizon. But there is a qualification here as well, because while the risk horizon for us is within the 5 years, the simulation horizon is longer. It spans decades, as I will show later on. We also covered investment and pension funds, although the exercise investment funds was quite minor, beyond the banks and insurers. There are also similarities between the two exercises, like the fact that we both adopted static balance sheets, which is basically the balance sheets at the end of 2020. This this is a recap of the overall work we've done. The main exercise is this that you see at the center. This is scenario-based analysis based on scenarios from the NGFS, Network for Green Financial System, and we use two vintages of the scenarios, the phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1 was published in 2020, phase 2 in 2021. And for these, we ran an exercise to measure the impact on corporate loan portfolios of banks, securities portfolios of banks, securities portfolios of life and general insurers, and securities holdings of UK domiciled funds and pension funds. There was also some sensitivity analysis, which was run on transition risk of mortgage loan portfolios, physical risk of sovereign bonds portfolio for banks, and also physical risk for technical reserves for insurers. Quite important is this aspect of the focusing on a short near-term horizon, and this was done through this idea of the climate Minsky moment. So, in the words of the previous governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, in a speech in 2016, when he started to introduce these concepts to the larger public, we can consider this as a wholesale reassessment of prospects as climate-related risks are reevaluated that could destabilize markets, spark a procyclical crystallization of losses, and lead to a persistent tightening of financial conditions. The way we sort of operationalize this is to imagine a long horizon, like an horizon down to 2050, but then focusing on the nearer term, 2020 to 2025, by discounting of companies' future cash flows to equity back to the climate Minsky point, which we assume to occur during the horizon, 5-year horizon of the FSAP, something like say in 2024. And by discounting back all the cash flows and the different scenarios, we managed to get a sense of what would be the change in the net present value of companies under different scenarios. So this way we can estimate the company's market value of assets, and through a Merton approach, also the market value of equity and other important parameters like distance to default, probability of default, and credit spreads. This is the main idea of the climate Minsky moment, and we also I mean, as I say, this is the most important concept is that of focusing on the near-term horizon, assuming that there is a fundamental mispricing of climate-related risk. But if you want, not even a mispricing, just the fact that markets are currently not believing in an ambitious transition scenario like the one that would be needed if Paris Agreement goals were really to be achieved. Until there is some constellation of events that it's not specified, but we have some narrative for that. And if you want, I can spend some words on that later on, where there is a reassessment of companies' future cash flows and consequently of asset values over a 30-year horizon. This is another way looking at the operationalization of the climate Minsky moment. So different scenarios. Under business usual scenarios, the cash flow, the earnings of a company are assumed to grow at a certain rate, and under the transition scenario, the company might have a reduction in its cash flows. It's not necessarily a reduction. We will see it for some companies. There could be even an increase. Of course, it's easy to imagine that, for example, a company invested in renewables might have actually an actual increase of earnings under the transition scenario. This translates into a difference in the net present values. And when we look at the whole distribution of equity values across companies, we will see that the distribution sort of spreads and shifts to the left. It spreads because there is a heterogeneity in the results. There are, as I was saying, companies that would do much worse, companies that would do better. On average, there will be an impact because, of course, decarbonization policies are meant to increase the cost of energy anyway, and so tend to have a negative impact. Although, of course, there are also benefits in the longer term from decarbonizing. Now, a few words about the specific NGFS scenarios that we chose. As I say, there are two vintages of these scenarios, the one published in June 2020 and the one in 2021. Both these vintages have some scenarios that represent a bit the current situation, where countries are assumed to follow their national determined contributions that they committed to as part of the Paris Agreement. And we know that these are not sufficient to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement, not ambitious enough. So if there is a need to make this policy more ambitious, there is a need to shift to a different scenario. And on the first vintage, we consider scenarios as 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the maximum increase of temperature above pre-industrial levels, with carbon dioxide removal technologies. And this is considered an orderly scenario. So one where there is the transition is orderly, is gradual, is in a way can still be metabolized by companies and by the financial system. We also considered running a disorderly scenario like 1.5 degrees Celsius with limited carbon dioxide removal, but it was quite an extreme scenario that for one of the models we were using would not converge. So eventually we focus only on the 1.5 degrees with carbon dioxide removal. When the new vintage of scenarios, NGFS scenarios was published in June 2021, we repeated the exercise again, taking the national determined contribution scenario as a sort of business as usual, and looking at net zero 2050, which is a new scenario produced by the NGFS. And it's a scenario that aims at containing the increase of temperatures within 1.5 degrees. And again, this is an orderly scenario. We would have ideally liked to also measure with respect to a disorderly scenario, but we eventually focus only on the orderly one. This is important in the interpretation of the results, because it's important to remember we didn't focus on the most extreme scenarios in terms of transition risks. Now, here you can see how different these scenarios are. In the purple one at the bottom is the evolution of carbon prices in the world under the national determined contribution scenarios. Now, this is actually the national determined contribution for phase one. The phase two is a bit higher path, but still it's relatively low. While in order to reach the 1.5 degree maximum global warming, carbon prices have to rise quite substantially under the phase one 1.5 degrees scenarios, and even more under the phase two net zero 2050 scenario. This has implication for global GDP growth rates, as you can see from this chart on the right, where the dashed lines are the ones of the GDP growth rates under the national determined contribution scenarios, and the continuous lines instead are those for the transition scenarios that we have selected. And in blue you have the phase one, and in red the phase two. So as you can see, there is of course a gap in terms of growth rates under the transition scenario with respect to the national determined contributions. So this is the difference we try to estimate in terms of impact on companies' cash flows and net present values. Now, what is important to understand is that the NGFS produces this scenario that are not complete. They just provide a lot of variables, because they model the climate system, the energy system, the land use system, and the economy. but still for the economy, they have a limited number, they produce a limited number of variables. They have a limited, still a limited breakdown in terms of sectors, and basically no financial variables. So we had to expand, and for this we use a model that we have at the we use at the IMF, which is the GTAP, generally used for analysis of trade, international trade, and particularly we use the E version, which is the energy version of GTAP. This GTAP gave us allowed us to estimate the evolution of gross value added for different sectors under the different scenarios. Then we also tried to, after differentiating across sectors, we wanted also to differentiate a bit within sectors, at least for the largest companies. For this, we use climate credit analytics, which is a suite of models by Oliver Wyman and Standard & Poor's. And these allowed us to understand the impact at a more granular level. What is important to understand in this exercise, there is no macro modeling beyond what is the bare few variables available in NGFS. This is a bit different from an exercise, in particular also from the exercise of the Bank of England. It was to be very, very transparent, it was only partially a choice in the sense that there were some limitations at that time, while now other exercises we are running at the fund use macro models. At the time that was not available, but I consider at the same time a gap, but also a feature, because this is a field where there is a lot of uncertainty. Adding macro modeling on top of other modeling inevitably opens the number of degrees of freedom that the modeler has, because at the point you need to ask yourself what will be the fiscal policies, what will be the monetary policies, and the results can change dramatically. So in a way, this is a way to focus mainly on the impact from the corporate side, assuming an unchanged policy scenario except for the decarbonization policies. So I took this chart from the Banque de France, and just to show that unlike what was done by the Banque de France, as was done also by the Bank of England, here we have the macro modeling is not part of the exercise. A quick few words on the breakdown. We had a breakdown by sectors, trying to have a breakdown that would separate the most carbon intensive sectors from the less carbon intensive ones, and also focusing on the regions that are relevant for the UK financial system. So of course, UK, European Union, but also Canada, Japan, USA, Hong Kong, China, rest of Asia, and rest of the world. And here you can see a few examples of percentage deviation of gross value added from the national determined contribution scenario for a number of sectors. For example, oil sector in the UK, under the assuming that the transition scenario is the phase one 1.5 degrees with the carbon dioxide removal, and or the phase two net zero 2050. And as you see, and this reflects what I was saying before, the results are more extreme under the net zero 2050. Similarly for the European Union gas sector. However, as I was saying, there are also sectors that stand to gain from this transition, and they gain more the more ambitious or at least the more higher the path for carbon prices, which is what you observe for the UK and US electricity sector. As I say, the heterogeneity within sector was captured via CCA, and here the idea is to translate the GVAs, the gross value added, into average free cash flows to equity by sector. And then these are mapped into single companies, and the free cash flow to equities to equity of different companies are up to 2050 are discounted back to the climate Minsky point by applying the equity return by sector, basically the risk-free rate plus risk premium. This is done under both business as usual and the transition scenarios, repeating the exercise with the 1.5 degrees plus carbon dioxide removal and net zero 2050. Okay, at this point, we have a change in the net present value of companies, and we use this as basically as a representation of the change in the market value of equity at the climate Minsky point. And this can be plugged in directly into equity holdings to estimate the impact on equity portfolios. It also determines the default rate by simply counting the percentage of firms whose equity is wiped out. And this is used in estimating loss rates in the bank's loan portfolios together with LGD that is assumed constant. But it also allows us to determine a change in the default distance to default, which is an important metric used to understand how to extract information from markets about the default risk of companies, and can be used to basically estimate a change in rating and a change in credit spreads on corporate bonds. This is then used to reprice bonds and estimate the impact on corporate bond portfolios. For the pension funds, of course, these are the two important mappings. Here you see the results, the average results by sector. Not surprisingly, coal is the one. I mean, you can focus on the blue and now orange bars, and you can see the coal sector is clearly one that stand to suffer a lot, but also oil and gas, petroleum products, while there are some sectors that can gain in under the transition, I mean, in the shift to a transition scenario. And this is more so for the phase 2 scenario, because phase 2 scenario is as more dispersion, heterogeneity across sectors. These are the results in terms of the default rates, and of course they mirror what we saw in terms of equity. And these are the results in terms of credit spreads, where you see that the credit spreads in the coal sector could spike up more than 400 basis points under the in assuming a switch between national dynamic contribution and phase 2 transition scenario. Now, when translating these into impacts on financial institutions' portfolios, here we see the impact on the largest 8 banks. You can disregard the last column. It's an exercise we made to understand the impact in case risk premia also went up. But let's focus on the numbers at the center. So you see, for corporate loan portfolio, the losses could be either 24 billion pounds or 79 under phase 2 scenarios. So this is quite a dramatic change in terms of the impacts on between the two scenarios. For equity portfolio and corporate bond portfolio of banks, we have either $7 billion under phase 1 or 11.5 under phase 2. For comparison, we here report the amount of credit impairments on all loan portfolios, not only corporate, in 2021 and 22 under the Bank of England 2021 solvency stress test exercise, which was almost $70 billion. And just let me remind you, there was no major risk for financial stability under the 2021 solvency stress test exercise. The capital shortfalls of bank were largely affordable, I mean, manageable. But I just want to say, this is just to say that the potential losses at the Climate Minsky point are of a similar size, so are not negligible, definitely. For the corporate securities portfolios of bonds and equity, we see that the average loss would be, for these 8 banks, would be 2.8% of the portfolio under phase 1 and 4.1 under phase 2, but it could go up depending on the banks to 3.4 or 7.7 respectively under the 2 type of scenarios. And for insurers, we tested 8 large insurers and 7 large general insurers. You can see here under the phase 1 scenarios, the loss is around, on average, around -2. For life insurers, and minus 1.5 for general insurers. And under phase 2, these of course increase and become next to minus 3% for life insurers and almost 3% for general insurers. And let me compare these results with those of the Bank of England exercise. So this is what you can find in the report with the results of the CBS. You see these are the early action, late action scenarios. The turquoise and orange bars are the ones that are important for us because I make a comparison, and the wholesale portfolio because we were focusing on corporates. Now, the comparison is not straightforward because here results are reported in terms of percentage of climate losses with respect to a counterfactual that basically is a scenario where there are no climate risks. And I could not find these results. Maybe Chris Faint then can tell us something more about this. But I mean, in my calculation, this should correspond more or less to 50 billion, which, if you want, is midway between the two estimates we have. So I think that the results are quite similar. And for the insurers, instead, the Bank of England seems to find larger losses if you look over the 30 years. But let me remind you that in our case, we have losses that are discounted back. And so in a way are a sort of average of different of losses at different times and discounted back. So it's less straightforward to make a comparison. Finally, what is more important for you, of course, is the results for the pension funds. We with the help of the pensions regulator, we obtain data from a small sample of corporate occupational defined benefit pension schemes, around 70, representing 1/3 of the segment in terms of total assets, around $320 billion. We prepared an ad hoc survey to collect data on the equity and bond holdings aggregated by asset class, industry, sector, and for bonds type of bond and modified duration. And these are the results. I would say that they are similar in magnitude to those for the security holdings of banks and insurers. Under the phase 1 and GFS scenarios, the weighted average portfolio loss of the climate misky point would be on average approximately 2%, with individual scheme results ranging from -7 to 0%. You can see them here. In the case of phase 2 scenarios, the range expands from -12.5 to 0, and the average also raises in terms of absolute loss to 3.5. Now, I added a couple of slides here because I just wanted to expand a bit the view about what is being done currently by other international institutions, central banks, but also the academia. And there are many different approaches. I found a recent paper as an approach that is very similar to the one we adopted and looked specifically at stranded fossil fuel assets and how these translate into losses for investors in advanced economies. I found this interesting also because it mentions a few times the pension funds. They look at financial institutions worldwide, and they look at the distribution of ownership of transition risk associated with stranded fossil fuel assets. They found that the present value of future lost profits in the upstream oil and gas sector, this focus basically only on the oil and gas sector, exceeds $1 trillion under plausible change in expectations about the effects of climate policy. As I say, the overall approach is very similar to ours, where there is an assumption of change in expectations. Included in the equity loss is $90 billion owned directly by pension funds. So this is quite a remarkable number. They also observed that most of the market risk falls on private investors, overwhelmingly in OECD countries. I mean, I think one important conclusion here of the study is that when one looks back to the overall chain of ownership, these risks, this transition risk, are not necessarily so distant from the advanced economies. I mean, advanced economies tend to have more diversified economic systems, so can absorb the transition risk that is generated domestically quite well. But the point of this study is that there is a return effect that comes from the exposure to foreign corporates and foreign assets. And this is something we also try to do. As I showed to you, we also looked at exposures all over the world. So this is an important aspect to keep in mind. Finally, they also raise a warning about the fact that, okay, financial stability might not be challenged, but the large exposure of pension funds remains a major concern. So I found this study quite interesting, both for its similarity with our approach, but also for its insight into risk for pension funds in particular. Here, just the mentions. As I say, there were other exercises. One was the sensitivity analysis on the securities portfolio for sovereign bond exposures in particular in the banks. This exercise was done only for banks. I didn't repeat it for pensions funds for technical reasons. We can discuss it later on, but basically because I couldn't do a full revaluation, I would have to use modified duration, and given the very long maturity of the holdings, this would have produced results that they were not very reliable. But just to say that there is the possibility that this also will be a channel where there could be an impact, an important impact. So although we focus on corporate bonds, it will be important to also keep an eye on what happens to the sovereign bonds. Here we come to the conclusions on the results. So while the results from the main exercise, the one I described, do not point to imminent threats to financial stability in the UK, the potential losses are non-negligible. As I was pointing out with the comparison with the solvency stress test, results of the solvency stress test for the Bank of England. Also considering that we focus exclusively on corporate exposures. Also, I remind you that we model only an orderly scenarios, orderly transition scenarios, and of course there could be the outcome could be less benign under a scenario characterized by disorderly transitions. There are other things that we didn't consider. Losses could be amplified by adverse changes in market parameters. We did a sensitivity test for risk premium just to show how they can increase, but there are other things that could change. Equity volatility, credit spreads. We assumed a migration of companies to different credit spread rating classes and related credit spreads. But for each rating class, if you want, credit spreads could also increase as LGDs could increase. There could be second round effects in terms of direct, indirect contagion, macrofinancial feedback, and so on. We didn't have a macroeconometric module, and adding these could change results in either direction. You could, depending on how you there is someone asking for the QR code, so maybe we can show the QR code again after I finished. So adding the macroeconometric module could materially change in either direction. It could be, you can think of policy responses that can exacerbate the impact of transition risk or attenuate it. Okay, here a comparison with the conclusions from the CBS as reported by, given by Sam Woods, BOE's Deputy Governor for Prudential Regulation, in his presentation on the results of the CBS last month. So he also says that he didn't found their findings do not point to a worrying direct impact on the solvency of banks and insurers. So these are not the kind of losses that would make question the stability of the system, but any positive message needs to be taken with a major pinch of salt, both because there is a lot of uncertainty in these projections and because the drag on profitability will leave the sector more vulnerable to other future shocks. This is something that, of course, we have very much in our mind these days. When there is a compounding of shocks, you have a pandemic that was already not foreseen, and then on top of that, you have geopolitical developments that compound and inflation. And so you can also think of the climate risks compounding other forms of shocks. This is something, for example, the fund has done in the case of the Philippines, when we ran an important pilot on physical risk, and we combined at a certain point the impact on a major typhoon with a recession, an imported recession. Another conclusion that's very important from the speech by Sam Woods is that the exercise is not going to be used to set capital requirements for banks and insurers. The results are still uncertain and subject to further development that it's really not. I think that most prudential regulators are extremely resistant to translate them directly in capital requirements. Finally, a couple of words on the advantage of the climate risky moment approach. It's a sort of magnifying lens on threats to financial stability that are probably more relevant in the nearer than in the longer term. So it allows to reconcile these different horizons. In terms of the working assumption, is it plausible to assume that the climate risky moment can happen? Well, it certainly there is some plausibility based on the fact that markets do not seem to price transition risk, or at least they do not price the transition risk that would be generated by an ambitious decarbonization scenario. And I conclude here. Just let me say that, of course, I think all of this is quite relevant for the pensions fund sector. And we are very glad that we managed to work on this data, because it gave us a first idea of how this kind of exercises could run on pension schemes. Thank you. Here is the QR code for the participant who wanted to submit a question.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to say thank you to both of you. Thank you, Udaibir and Pierpaolo, for fascinating presentation. I'll now go to questions, if I may, on Slido. So if I just get onto that, we've got a few. Just to remind people that this is being recorded, so we will be sending out a link, so there's no need to worry about getting copies of slides, etc. You will get access to the full recording. So starting from the top, just bear with me a second. So first question here is how much does the IMF modeling rely on general equilibrium? And if significant, is that concerning?
I was saying that this model, the GTAP-E, for the sectoral expansion, is a general equilibrium model, is a computational general equilibrium model. So this was exactly the reason we wanted to use this, because it is important to capture how the for example, shock to carbon prices would spread across and within the economic systems, how we will alter relative prices, and so demand and supply of different input factors, outputs, and that this is something that has to be done with the general equilibrium model. So we did it for the sectoral expansion, but as I said, we didn't have micro modeling, so we didn't have more general equilibrium model to also better characterize other macroeconomic variables like unemployment, interest rates, and so on. We had these for the gross value added of different sectors.
Thank you. So on to the next question here. If we rely too much on CCS, which may be the case, and then CCS fails to gain traction, does that accelerate the arrival of the Minsky moment and its intensity?
That's a very interesting question. Okay, CCS, you I guess assume carbon capture and storage, which is some of the technologies that are included under carbon dioxide removal. I must say that one of the main difference between phase 1 and phase 2 scenarios is exactly this. Phase 1 scenario are more generous in the assumption about the availability of carbon dioxide removal technologies, and phase 2 are a bit less. And I think, at least this is my interpretation, this is partly explains why the carbon price path under the net zero 2050 scenario is is steeper than under the phase 1 scenario, even though the climate goal is very similar. So I would say that there is already some variation in the availability of the technologies in different vintages of NGFS scenarios. Now, I think NGFS will produce soon a third vintage. It will be interesting to see. I think that these less reliance, this reduced reliance on carbon dioxide removal is a reflection of a criticism that there has been to the fact that the assumptions were too generous. And so I think we are going towards the right direction. I wouldn't be able to say whether the assumption are still too generous or maybe they're just right or more or less right.
Thank you. And what looks like it was a follow-up question to the earlier one around relying on general equilibrium. There was a mention here also of a reliance on substitutability, where there is no biosphere B and pricing signals may be weak.
Sorry, there is no
biosphere B. So I know this one's from Mike, and you can actually join us, Mike. Do you want to just explain that one?
Thank you. Yes, the point is that a lot of economic modelling tends to assume the biosphere is a free gift, and therefore the pricing signals where we're sort of using the biosphere a bit for free. Does that make sense? I'm sorry if it was a bad question.
No. Okay. No, sorry. I just sorry. Okay, I understand now your question. I think that at the moment these scenarios do not capture this kind of I mean, they capture this mechanism up to a certain point. For example, as I say, these scenarios are produced by integrated assessment models. They also model land use, so the use of land, and so in a way, there is some of the balance in terms of, for example, of emissions, say emission sink and emissions. So I think there is some degree, but certainly not. These are not yet scenarios that completely model also the depth of the economic system towards the biosphere. And I don't know if maybe Chris Faint wants to add something on this now or later on, if he knows something more about the most recent ideas at the NGFS on this. Did I reply to your question, David?
This is Mike.
Sorry, Mike.
Yeah, you replied to my question excellently, and I can talk about this on the later panel if it's helpful. But I think one of the challenges, I convened a group of people around this issue some months ago, and the problem, we're very supportive of the Minsky approach and the way that it encourages urgency on a problem which is often seen too smoothly, going back to some of Udaibir's initial comments. And the problem seems to be that it's very easy in some ways to model the less important things, but whether it's, you know, mass migration or the effect of regulations or the possible outcome of the 2024 US election, there's a whole range of variables. And one of the things that we came up with was, when I say scenario, do you, and this is not you, this is anybody, do you think narrative or do you think modelling? And we are very keen on having more narrative as well as improving the modelling, because the narrative can capture things and parameterize them with the sort of best guess. So that's probably a conversation for offline, but I'll leave it back to other questioners. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just on this point, I think, no, I fully agree. I think we will agree, both of us. Getting the narrative is absolutely right before you get into any, complicated modeling, because to get a narrative on this, on the climate is very complicated and very, very complicated. And let's get the story first before we get down to.
Well, that's lovely. We've coined the phrase "narratives eat modelling for breakfast."
Right. Okay.
Well, I mean, yeah, I suppose I don't know whether I said that one of the feedbacks we are getting, probably less from UK or the advanced markets, from the developing country members, is that this whole thing is becoming very complex in order to be put to work and for them to take policy decisions at the local level. So I think we have to be a little careful as to how far we want to take the technology to a point where it becomes counterproductive to agile, short end type of decision that may be taken. If a Minsky moment was to come up in a less mature country, then the system has to be nimble enough to allow it to sort of get back into, the intervention can take place. So I'm just putting it that yes, narrative alone, I'm a strong believer personally. I don't know where Pierpaolo is, but I think getting a narrative is absolutely vital.
We'd be very supportive of that
Right.
point, because we feel that the NGFS scenarios are probably inapplicable to many developing countries. They're better for developed, but with developing, we just, yeah. Anyway, I will depart.
Yes, if I can, just to be honest, I mean, this was a climate risk exercise, but the presentation gives a lot in terms of the technology. There is also and the same is for the actually technical note that we published. And probably surely the reasoning that there was behind in terms of narrative is not there, but there was a lot of reason in terms of narrative, and the reason you have that climate Minsky moment in 2024 is not by coincidence. 2024 could be a pivotal year in terms of what will happen. I mean, this is very much a personal conviction more than official IMF policy, but my interpretation, I mean, the climate change is a global problem. As a global problem, it needs global solutions. And it's very clear that the European Union and the UK are going in a certain direction. Maybe not at the speed that is needed, but they're going in a certain direction. This is clearly not enough. So there needs to be a coalition, or someone call it a club, of jurisdictions that point decisively towards ambitious climate mitigation policies. And of course, the US must be, is probably the most important member in such a club, considering that China maybe might be ambiguous, but probably has enough firepower to go more decisively towards green policies. So what happens in the US will be extremely determinant for whatever happens all over the world. And of course, we know what is the situation, political situation in the UK. So you can have in 2024 an administration that pulls out of the Paris Agreement again, and so you probably will have a late, for the Bank of England, a late action scenario, so that everything will happen probably only by 2030, and the world has to accelerate immensely. Or you might have instead the surprise of an administration that is climate friendly by 2024 unexpectedly, and there you have a climate Minsky moment probably. So I think there is reasoning behind the narrative. However, I mean, we always need to eventually put some numbers around our ideas. So of course, the modeling is also very important.
Right. Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm conscious of time, and I'm conscious there's one or two questions still to be answered, but we'll look at getting those answers to you in slower time. And yes, we'll look at making slides available as well as the recording. Right, so if I may, I'd like to hand over now to Chris Faint, head of the Climate Hub at the Bank of England. Chris, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Can I check? Can you hear me, first of all?
Yes.
You can. Oh, fantastic. Right, I know that you're just a little bit behind time. So what I can do today is a 10-minute presentation on the results of the Climate Biennial Scenario exercise that we released just at the end of last month. And Pierpaolo, Udaibir, it's nice to see you again. There is a huge amount of content in this report. So what I'll try to do is just draw out some of the features that I think are most of interest to the audience here. And just by way of introduction, as Mark said, my name is Chris Fain. So I run the Climate Hub division, which sits at the centre of all the bank's Climate Hub work. But just to get straight into it, what we did is over the last 3 or so years, we've been developing a scenario framework to look at climate. And the reason that we do that is because climate change is relevant to all of our objectives at the bank, safety and soundness and financial stability, and maybe even monetary stability. It's something that we are exploring. So it's something that we have been exploring in detail. There are 3 objectives to the CBES, the ones on the screen. The first one was to assess and promote improvement of participants' climate risk management capabilities, because this is a quite new area, and also to develop our own capabilities at the central bank and at the regulator, because this is new for us as well. The second one is to size the financial exposures of participating firms in the financial system more broadly in relation to climate risk. And the third is to understand the challenges to participants' business models as these risks evolve. And the idea was that these this analysis and these objectives would allow us to build our understanding of these risks, and we could then share those domestically and internationally. But a key thing to flag is that we knew that this would not be an end state model. We knew that this is a learning exercise, and we knew that it would have to be a partial model. So it did not seek to do absolutely everything. Now, if I get into the design on the next slide, please. To deliver the exercise, we used 3 stylized scenarios that I think have been touched on before, that explore both physical and transition risk. And these are based on the NGFS scenarios, which I know that you have touched on earlier in the session. On the left-hand side, we had an early action scenario where we take effective steps with immediate effect to reduce emissions by 2050. And the main risk in that scenario is transition risk, which builds up over time over the 30 years, but in a measured way. The second one is the scenario in the middle, which is where the same emissions levels are broadly achieved at 2050, but it's disorderly because you wait 10 years and then you take all the action to transition at that point. So you're squeezing a lot more change into a shorter period. And then the right-hand side, we've got the no additional action scenario, which is where policymakers fail to enact further policies. And what you have is a build-up of physical risks over time. And I should say that in that scenario, we were conscious that the build-up of irreversible physical risks would probably happen outside of the 30-year timeframe that we were modelling. So instead of modelling what those physical risks would look like from 2020 to 2050, we brought forward 2050 to 2080 just to understand how those risks might arise when they do arise, because just because they sit outside of this 30-year period doesn't mean they're not going to be important to us from both a financial stability and a safety and soundness perspective. On the next slide, I'm going to go really, really quickly through this because I think it's probably less relevant, and there's a huge amount of detail here, but we wanted to understand the risk management capabilities of firms. And one of the key thing we found is that they have developed, they're doing a lot better than they did, and especially a couple of years ago, but there's a huge amount more to do as firms seek to get data, build models, and understand how climate risks are going to affect their businesses. The strength that firms demonstrated was embedding climate in their governance processes. So they're discussing it at the top level of institutions, and understanding is building. But I think it's fair to say that there's still quite a long way to go to embed it across their organizations in a really meaningful way, where you see climate in risk appetites and priced in and understood in a similar way to other risks. Now, I could have spent a huge amount of time on that, but in the interest of time, let me get straight to the headline losses, which the headline findings, which is on the next slide. So getting a bit deeper into these results, this chart from our report shows losses across the different types of participants and the different scenarios over the full 30 years. And I think it's really important to be clear on scope here. For banks, these numbers are only credit losses. They did not look at traded losses. And for life insurance, they are losses on invested assets. And for general insurers, they're losses on invested assets plus losses for the liabilities. But we did not look at losses across the full balance sheet. And that's due to scope predominantly. And that scope is due to capacity of institutions and ourselves to look at these risks. But in future exercises, we will want to look at all risks. And also want to stress that these are being calculated on the basis of a fixed balance sheet. So what we've said is, look at your balance sheet today as a proxy for your business model, and then look at how that balance sheet or your business model would be impacted by the scenarios over time. So you're looking at the vulnerability of today's business model to changes over time, which is different to looking at how firms will evolve their balance sheet over time. There's a number of pros and cons for that structure, which maybe we can get into in the panel. So the key messages that I would take from this is, first, as you can see from the mustard bars, total climate losses across participants are largest in the no additional action scenario on the right. And in contrast to the transition scenarios, in a no additional action scenario, the losses would continue to build past the 30-year CBES horizon. Second, losses across participants are quite a bit lower in the early action scenario on the left than in the late action scenario in the middle, which makes some sense because you get to transition over a longer period in a more gradual way. And these projections of losses from banks and insurers suggest that they would be able to bear the losses of transition and physical risk without substantial impacts on their solvency positions. But it's really important to contextualize that. Whilst we're not saying this is a solvency issue, we only looked at certain risks, and those losses are not evenly distributed across all firms. They happen in different periods of time and they attach to different sectors. So there will be bubbles of risks. And also the scenarios look at a gradual buildup of risk over time. They don't look at lumpy risks. They don't look at Minsky moments, and that could create a different risk profile. So we are certainly not complacent about the risks. But in this situation, if they're not creating a solvency issue, what we take from that is that on the whole, firms will be able to lend into the transition. They'll be able to support firms that need transition funding. So we would expect that to be able to facilitate a smoother transition than if banks were having to suddenly stop lending and insurers were having to stop investing in certain assets. Now, and let me just talk through the next slides, three or four charts from the results that I think are particularly important. The first one is this one, which is my favorite chart. So to underline the uncertainty, what this chart shows is the projected losses on shared counterparties spanned a wide range, with the most conservative estimate for losses around 10 times higher on average than the least conservative. So where banks have the same counterparty, one bank assumed that the losses would be 10 times higher than another bank, all things being equal. So it shows just how judgmental the results in this space are at the moment. On the next slide, it just digs into banks' corporate losses for the most at-risk sectors. Unsurprisingly, some of the most carbon-intensive industrial sectors and those most exposed to physical risks account for the largest portion of total losses on bank lending. So that's not surprising. But what this chart also shows is that it's not just the energy producers such as BP or Shell that are going to be affected. Banks and insurers have told us that that these losses are economy-wide, affecting users as well as producers of energy. Manufacturing in the middle of the chart is a really good example of this. So it's not just the usual candidates that will be impacted. And on the next slide, a similar picture of differing but economy-wide losses is seen with insurers. So this chart of the most at-risk sectors for insurers shows again that while some losses are concentrated in the usual suspects, other sectors are affected too. So agriculture and construction being clear ones from here. And you'll see that some of these equity losses are very, very large, and they would of course be seen by other holders of equities such as pension funds. So you see how through different channels these losses can affect different members of the economy. And then in terms of the going through charts, the next chart looks at how losses then flow from insurance companies. And what this demonstrates is that it's not the case that all these losses will fall on insurers and just be borne by insurers. What this chart shows is that only a small fraction of life insurers' total investment losses fall on shareholders. Much of the rest, 90% actually, of the 200 billion of investment losses, in the no additional action scenario is passed through to policyholders. Going on to the next slide, what I wanted to quickly touch on was how exposures reduced to certain sectors. In the interest of time, I will not go through with the details on this slide, but what you can see is that through the different scenarios, there is quite a strong reduction in lending to certain sectors, and you'll see that the purple line on that graph is the most impacted, which is the no additional action scenario. So in that one, they pull away from investing in certain sectors. This is not surprising, but from a financial stability perspective, this is concerning because you will need to have investment in certain sectors in order for them to become green over time. So what we want to ensure is that the movement away from those sectors is done in a measured way, is done with clear transition plans, and is done in a way that does not leave unnecessary assets stranded. But it's not all gloom. On the next slide, we just give a little glimmer of hope on opportunities. So this is where, in light of new opportunities, new investments are going. And the key message is that the firms identified more opportunities to expand lending in the transition scenarios than the no additional action scenario. And in the two transition scenarios, banks plan to increase lending substantially to some components of the gas and electricity supply sector, specifically to renewable energy. So it's shown that there is a channeling of funding to certain sectors. And of course, this will also be reflected in equity valuations and the kind of assets that pension companies will be investing in. So finally, on the last slide, I just wanted to just talk through the headline messages that we would ask you to take away from the CBES. The first one is that climate change and the transition to net zero creates risks for businesses and households, and through them to the financial system. So it's a real risk to the economy, and the CBES gives us a window on that. In terms of scale, the climate risks captured by the CBES scenario are likely to create a drag on the profitability of insurers and banks. For example, in the late action scenario, it represents 110 billion of extra losses, around 45 billion of which were concentrated in the few years immediately after transition. And that is a really, really chunky number that will fall on banks and insurers. The results highlight the overall cost of climate change will be lowest with early, well-managed transition. And we also know that losses will be lower if participants are able to identify and manage climate risks effectively. Some climate costs that initially fall on banks and insurers may be passed on, though, to their customers. And we identified a significant gap in insurance to properties in floodplains, which would have a justness element to allocation of services. And the scenarios used in this scenario are also stylized. So we need to make sure that we look at them for what they are. They're not forecasts. They're just certain scenarios, and they're just partial scenarios at that. So we should not take this as the answer or an answer. It's an exercise to identify how to manage these risks. And finally, just in terms of next steps, we're thinking about what we're going to do as follow-ons to this exercise. We're working internationally with groups such as the NGFS, and we're really pleased to have worked with the IMF over the last year to just work together to understand how we can build our toolkits out better, because we don't have the perfect toolkit. It's better, it's definitely better than it was a year ago, but it's constantly improving. So we should make sure that we work collectively to build that toolkit as quickly as possible, because we don't have a huge amount of time. Now, I will stop there. That was an incredibly whistle-stop tour through our results, but hopefully that's just given you a flavour for what we've done. And we, of course, have our report that's public. So we would ask you to all download that and have a look at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Absolutely fascinating again, and I think that's given us a bit of food for thought. I say, as we now transition into the panel discussion, I'm afraid, Chris, Mike has already got in there with a question for you, and it's very much about the Minsky moment. And if I can just find it, it's very much asking how soon might the bank include a Minsky approach in its scenarios?
Well, we haven't decided what the next steps are for our scenarios yet, so I can't answer that. But one of the things that we're asking all the banks and insurers that we regulate to look at is just to think through the different types of risks that could impact them, and think through what would be most impactful for their book. So one of the things that we'd like to understand from banks and insurers is about how they're thinking about Minsky moments, what they think the probability of a Minsky moment is. But Mike, it's a really good question, and it goes to the use of scenarios. One of the risks of running scenarios is that you can only run certain scenarios, and there's always going to be caveats about what's driving those scenarios. My concern sometimes is that people look at the results of the scenarios but not the caveats, and don't have a full understanding of what those scenarios are saying. So we're really keen that with our CBES results, we don't pretend that it's the full story. We don't pretend it's the worst case scenario, and we don't pretend it's looking at all the risks. We're very clear on what it is, but we have to be conscious that sometimes people won't dig into that level underneath, and it's a challenge that we need to help try and manage.
Thank you. So I'll just start now by reintroducing our panel for everybody's benefit. So I say we have Mike Clark from Ario Advisory, Chris, who's just been talking, so Chris Fain from the Bank of England, David Fairs from TPR, and Kerry Perkins from A4S. So if I can start by looking at the questions and reminding people, if you have any questions, please get onto the Slido app, and say just to start things moving. Very much going to look at this from the perspective of why should trustees and asset owners care. So with that in mind, noting that time horizons are limited for most DB scheme trustees, Chris, I was wondering if you could maybe talk about something about the requirements on insurers and banks increasing and the potential for the insurance transfer market or the capital markets repricing.
Yeah, so I don't think it's right to say that climate risks are going to crystallize way into the future. There's a number of different channels through which they could crystallize sooner. So you could have the Minsky moment that we were just touching on. You could have a market moment where there's sudden reevaluation in the markets. That's not quite a Minsky moment, but the markets bring forward the risk because they look to adjust in the near term. And then we're in a space where governments have announced policies to get to net zero by 2050, but we're still finding out what the policies are. Those could have a significant impact in the shorter term. So I think the scope for climate change and the risks that it gives rise to have impacts on investments in the very short term is very much there. So that's why I think it's important to have an eye on what's going to happen to investments. But also there's a real collective challenge that when you speak to individual institutions, they think that they'll always have a level of foresight that will allow them to move before their competitors. Or their peers, but that's not always going to be the case. So there's an element to planning strategies that assume that you're not going to be able to invest at your optimal in the optimal way in the future, and that requires some planning. And hopefully, as the government builds up its disclosure regimes and transition plans come out, some of those risks should be easier to manage. But that will be in the medium term. So in the short term, I think everyone should be thinking about this and building their capabilities.
Right, thank you. David, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, look, I completely agree with Chris. We do get DB schemes, particularly mature DB schemes, saying, we really should be exempt from TCFD disclosures because actually, and within our timeline, this is not going to impact us, and if it is going to impact us, the impact will be so small it'll be untrue. I don't think we would agree with that. I don't think the minister agrees with that. The minister is very much in favour of every scheme should be thinking about climate related impacts, both the risk to the portfolios and members, but also some of the opportunities that arise. So whether you're DBDC, small or large, I think climate change is something that you need to think about and have regard to. And of course, there's a particular challenge, I think, if you're a DB scheme, that actually you're reliant probably still to some degree on your sponsoring employer, and your employer will be impacted. So understanding the impact on covenant is also going to be important. And if you don't think about both, then actually both of them may come back and bite you in quite a severe way. And perhaps if I could just plug, we're updating our covenant guidance to take account of climate change. So there'll be a lot more detail in that when it gets published late summer, early autumn.
Thank you.
Should I just, on the back of David's plug, just say that we're parallel. In parallel, we're A4S are producing some guidance that's coming out the end of this month on the employee covenant process and why and how pension schemes should be looking at the ESG risks and opportunities as part of the process. So which TPR are providing a forward. So we're very much aligned with our thinking around this, but we're doing that at the end of June.
Actually, Kerry, why don't you take the opportunity to do a bigger plug, because you're doing quite a lot on TCFD and disclosure. So why not get the full advert out there?
Hello. So yes, accounting for sustainability. So we started up a couple of years ago a ESG toolkit for pension fund, pension scheme chairs and trustees. So we specifically look at the trustee and exec office community within pension schemes and provide, whether that's guidance, whether that's case studies, whether that's signposting to third-party resources, to really help that trustee community understand, grow their knowledge, grow their confidence, and have those deep and meaningful conversations with either their service providers or internally. And so the employee covenant is the latest one that we're doing. But one of the key things that we've tested out with our asset owner network, which is made up of pension fund chairs predominantly in this country, is a maturity map. And the aim of this maturity map is for trustees around a table to workshop this maturity map to understand where they are, where their level of maturity is on different parts of a pension fund trustee's role, whether that's on asset allocation, investment decisions, whether it's on engagement across the investment chain. And we have found that that's been really interesting for pension fund trustees to do, driving consensus around the table about where their priorities should be, and also cross-comparing with their service providers, so asking their investment consultants to do a similar exercise, and then really kind of spurring on a kind of really detailed and potentially probing conversation about where they are as opposed to where they think they are. And I can obviously send more information later, but yeah, that's the role that we're doing there on the toolkit.
Thank you.
I think I'll stop plugging now.
No, feel free. And Mike, anything you'd like to add?
Well, I'd like to make a few points. I'd first like to reinforce Chris's really important point about foresight. Chris tends to live in the world of insurers and banks, and he's quite right. Even banks with a short-term horizon will have little foresight at the Minsky moment. That probably means asset managers won't either. And if you look at the trustee decision-making process, foresight is probably even harder as the Minsky moment approaches. My view is that given the difference between where the world is, pick your favorite temperature rise, but probably between 2.5 and 3, and at some point sort of humanity's desire to do something sensible, then a Minsky moment is almost guaranteed. And I think as that conversation permeates the trustee world, there'll be a lot more attention to risks to trustees. Just thinking through, there's the case in Australia that we all know about, REST. I know one trustee who's about to fire their investment consultant because they're useless at climate risk. I know another set of trustees who got their investment consultant to do some training. This turned out to be fairly useless, so they appointed their pensions lawyer to do some training on sort of climate and governance. And there's even whispers of litigation where an investment consultant gave, what should we call it, relaxed advice, which led to a relaxed trustee decision. So I think the sort of risks around some of these things which are not visible, I think the investment consultant sustainable working groups guide is very helpful. I suspect that investment consultants who've decided not to bring it to their client yet may be slightly worried that the assessment of the client, of the consultant's climate competency, might be weak. So I think there's a lot of things around here which I think really support this sort of Minsky, and we need, essentially to realise that something is likely to happen that we don't see coming. It's not for mentioning here, but there's some very good work being done on the way economics is developing about risk, which we can take offline. There's obviously the PRI's inevitable policy response, which effectively is a Minsky moment, which trustees will have seen, I'm sure. So I think there's lots of things which sort of encourage us that although the modelling is necessary, it misses out some of the important things as we discussed. And pension funds trustees need to get ahead of this, because frankly we know what we need to do by 2030. So saying I'll be off the hook in 5 to 10 years, that's probably leaving a bit of risk on the trustee table.
Absolutely, and I think that segues quite nicely into the next question that's been posted around what levers can be pulled. And I suppose within that you can talk about education, professional upskilling as one aspect of it. But if I open that up to you as a panel, what levers can be pulled? Chris, can we start with you?
Yeah, happy to. So I'm focused on the identification of risk and the pricing and the pricing of risk. So in terms of the levers that can be pulled, I think you've got a couple of different things that need to be done. The first one is having sight of what the end state would be. Where do we want to get to? What are the models and the data that we need in order to get there? There's no silver bullet for this. It's not as if some of this data exists somewhere and we just need to collate it. A lot of this data doesn't exist. A lot of this data is about building understanding in the real economy, about firms understanding what the transition is going to look like, and getting that data out there, understanding how those risks are going to develop. Some of that risk data is there, and it needs to be collated. And there's some work that groups like GFANZ are doing to get there. So that toolkit needs to be pulled together. But one of the key things that we've been saying, and this is really, really important, is that one of the levers that we need to have is creativity. And it sounds a bit trite, but in the absence of having the end state toolkit, we need to use judgments, expose those judgments, and not let the absence of some of those key data points and tools stop us thinking through these risks and acting on these risks. That is really difficult, though, because when you're in a regulated environment, or when you're publishing those judgments, or when you're making big decisions on the back of those judgments, it's unusual. So I think having transparency about those judgments, discussing those judgments, exposing them to your customers, that's really important. But what we shouldn't do in the absence of all the final levers being in place is just say, well, we can't do it. It's too difficult, because we haven't got time for that. Well, I'll stop there. I can carry on, but I'll stop there.
No, thank you very much. I'll bring David in, if I may.
Kerry is signalling very, very boldly. She wanted to jump in there.
All right. Okay.
I mean, I am an optimist. I do think actually with data improvements, that will give greater insights. I think methodologies will increase. I'm sort of a little bit with Mike that actually, although there'll be significant improvements in approaches, techniques in terms of the available data, actually there's a real danger that you lose sight of some of the qualitative impacts, the interpretive impacts of what you're doing. But of course, that's going to massively increase, I think, over the next 2 years because of the TCFD disclosures that are being imposed on the market. But I think it will throw up the so what moments and actually bring to the fore much greater stewardship responsibilities, and actually as asset owners, particularly in the pension sphere, engaging with their investment managers and their investee companies to drive change, I think is going to be incredibly important. So For me, it's taking action over the greater information flows and qualitative information that be around in the market that'll be really important.
Thank you.
And I would just say, David, on that point as well, on the role of the asset owners in asking for that data, is that if at once you don't succeed, try again. So we've spoken to many schemes now who have felt that they have requested this from their asset managers, and their asset managers have come back and said that they don't have that data required. And then some of them have pushed back, and they push back and say, we require this as part of our relationship with you. And lo and behold, they have then extended their data capabilities and delivered the necessary data. So I think really going back to the levers, what levers to pull, leverage your position as the client to really push on this. Because I don't think saying, well, we don't have that data is a good enough question. I'm not saying that means that the data doesn't exist, but there will be ways to develop that narrative. So definitely push back on that.
Can I build on that? Yeah, I mean, when you asked the levers question, I wrote down 5, and then while the others were speaking, I wrote down another 3. So let's try and condense that. Building on Kerry's point, one of the best levers is pension fund trustees asking good questions of their suppliers. And one of the challenges is, if the investment consultants are not always up with the game, who's going to provide those questions? So I guess that's a tip to David and Mark. So I think that's one thing. I think a very fundamental point, which came out in the DWP response to the consultation last Friday, is this notion that stewardship and climate are very aligned. I would argue that a pension fund trustee's whole job is stewardship. Sometimes investment managers try and narrow it down to sort of voting plus, whereas actually stewardship is in fact your strategic asset allocation, how you're allocating assets, because you're stewarding initially for your beneficiaries, and arguably we've all got to do a bit, sort of go a bit beyond that. So in fact, just touching on this for future discussions, the current concept of beta in finance theory sort of doesn't work with these cascading risks, so I just sort of flag that. And I think this focus on data, you can actually ask your suppliers about behavior. Because again, coming back to, the sort of 2.53 degrees problem, we've all got to change our behavior a lot and quite quickly. So I think on finding, we don't have a climate problem. We know what the temperature is going to be in 2031 pretty closely. So actually for 10 years, we've got a behavior problem. So I just think those are some of the levers. I'll throw in one crazy one, which was laughed at last week. We could dispense of TCFD disclosures if we all had good transition plans that were credible and assessed. Because if you've got a transition plan and you're working along a transition plan, you don't need much in the way of TCF disclosures, because you're actually disclosing what you're going to do, your milestones and how you're achieving it. And I think transition plans are going to be very powerful. I'll stop there.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm conscious of time. There's another question here that's popped up for you as a panel. So what do you think the key drivers for change might be in the next 5 to 10 years? So in that near term, who wants to start?
Well, I'll have a go at that. I think there will be an increasing number of mini Minsky moments. And in fact, again, I don't want to get too technical today, but there's some BEIS funded work with a project called the EEIST, which is the Economics of Energy Innovation and Systems Transformation. And if you knock out the E and they're left with EIST, you get to formation economics, which will evolve financial economics. So I think this, was it Maynard Keynes who said, it's not the new ideas that are the problem, it's getting rid of the old ones. So I think there's going to be some fairly fundamental thinking amongst asset owners and investment consultants around cascading risks and cascading opportunities, which is hardly in our thinking right now. And I think if we manage to do that, in a sense, the rest is detail. But at the moment, we're typically, we're just dealing with sort of minor things that don't move the dial. So I think thinking about risk and opportunity and bridging the gap between societal risk, and I must commend the Bank of England. The politicians have largely missed it, but in their climate change adaptation report of November 2021, and it's one of the key points made on Chris's last slide, we can only do financial risk. Governments do policy that reduces emissions. And I think developing that notion and almost encouraging, if I put it this way, the bank to make it clear to the Treasury that there's a limit to what the financial sector can do, and policy will provide that Minsky moment. I think some of the sort of deeper thoughts around this are what will change what happens. Thanks.
Thank you. Chris, do you want to go next?
Yeah, if I could come on that last point. I mean, it's true. The financial sector can only do so much. The real economy needs to take a lot of the action in order to reduce carbon, and the government obviously plays a fundamental role in setting the policy for how that carbon can be reduced. Look, one of the key things that I hope really changes over the next 5 years is that globally we get a lot more clarity on the policies that governments across the globe are going to put in place to get to net zero by 2050. But one thing that I think is going to be an absolute game changer, and I really hope it will be, is the development of international standards by the ISSB, so the International Sustainability Standards Board. So we know that disclosure is really useful, but disclosure is really, really useful when it's comparable and when it's suitably detailed, giving us the kind of metrics that we want to see. That's really tricky when you're looking at disclosures across different countries, and it's also really tricky when you're looking at something, frankly, that's really difficult. When it's more backward looking, it's more straightforward. When it's forward looking, you're using a whole load of judgments, and therefore, having a standard that looks to have more scrutiny over how you calibrate metrics and what those metrics should be, that allows them to be comparable between companies in different countries, that is a huge move forward. They've just started up. They've got an ambitious program for this year. By the end of this year, they hopefully will have a first set of recommendations. In 5 years' time, I would hope that those recommendations would have changed into actual disclosures that would have been adopted by different countries. And the mood music suggests that is actually pretty possible. There's lots of risk to it happening, but if that happens, it will be an absolute game changer. So fingers crossed.
Yeah, can I just sort of debate the point briefly? When anybody says 5 years, I say let's go for 2 to 3. And I think the acceleration will be around corporate behavior on those disclosures. So investors, which here means asset managers, will need to look at what boards are doing, and those data disclosures will be helpful. But actually, as an investor, I want to know what the board of this company is doing, because increasingly I want to move my capital to one that is moving the right direction and withdraw it from the others. So we're not going to get into the divestment debate, but the gradual withdrawal of capital and the possibility that insurers will increasingly cease to insure risks. And I take a slightly different view from Chris, because I want regulators to accelerate the movement of capital. I am not concerned about funding of the bad stuff. I want to accelerate the movement of capital to the good stuff. So I think there's some sort of, good debates to continue in this space.
Right, thank you. Kerry. Oh, I think we've lost her.
Sorry, no, I'm back.
Oh.
I don't think I've got any. I think it's all been covered really. What everyone has said.
All right, thank you. So David, anything from you?
Yeah, I mean, Chris said policy is really important. I'd probably say taxonomy is really important as well. And I think probably the thing for me that's going to move the dial is actually if collectively and individually as regulators, we stamp out greenwashing. And approaches to climate and sustainability exist entirely through the organisation, not just in the minds of the marketing department. So I think we're already seeing that organisations that are making bold claims around climate and sustainability are being held to account. And I think positive action around that intervention will actually mean that organisations take it seriously and don't just use it as a promotional tool in marketing.
Well, I think I've now got a question actually for David and Chris. I think, would we agree that GTAG will only deal with financial risk, and we need government policy to introduce the just transition?
We certainly need government policy to ensure there's a just transition.
Yeah.
As we identified in our scenario exercise, by shining a light on risks, it identifies areas where there will probably be gaps in provision of services. So the one that we identified was that it's likely that you're not going to be, some areas might be priced down to getting home insurance, and that of course has a justness impact. We can't fix that as a regulator, but what we can do is shine a light on it, and then government is best placed to think about if and how that needs to be addressed through policy.
Yes, I think asset owners have a role in supporting you with that messaging.
Right. Thank you very much. I just say conscious we've got a few minutes left, and so I thought I'd just introduce next steps, if I could, for you as a panel. So very much, what are the next steps, and within that are the things such as the need to account for biodiversity. Do we need to accelerate a shift to focus on outcomes, that sort of thing? So if I open that to you as a panel, is there anyone who would particularly like to start?
Well, let me be very quick, then let's going to have the rest of the time. I think the biodiversity is very important. The risk is if we spend a lot of time on it, we may not meet the climate challenge, therefore everything else becomes sort of stamp collecting. Next steps for me is simply encouraging everybody, including myself, to do more tomorrow than you did yesterday.
No, thank you. I can see David smiling there, so I will bring David in.
Well, I think how do you better a comment like that? I mean, that you almost have to end on a comment like that, don't you? It's, that is fantastic. I mean, I think we are in many ways at the beginning of a very long and difficult journey on climate. Many pension schemes talk to me about quality of data around the divergence of different techniques and approaches used by different consultants, and how the evolution is in approaches going to take place. I think it's inevitable that climate will get broadened to a broader sustainability approach. I think natural capital, biodiversity are bound to come into that at some point, because to some degree actually it's quite hard to split out in some areas the kind of overlapping nature of some of these things. So it's going to be a rich, fast developing and an interesting area, I think. And one of the challenges I think as we've got is that Udaibir, I think, said at the beginning is we've got a gap in a number of areas, got a gap in data, but we've got a gap in skills as well. And because this is a big and developing area, we do need the communities that supports pension schemes, banks, insurance companies to develop their their approaches, their level of sophistication, their level of understanding, so that actually there's a support mechanism for entities as they have to deal with these challenges.
Thank you. Kerry?
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm having problems with the internet and I got chucked out, so I missed the question, but I'm assuming it's around biodiversity and nature, was it?
Next steps, but do we need to?
On next steps.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I would say, as to the pension schemes that are in the audience today, that the next steps would be around understanding where your levers of your positions of influence are, and how you can pull on those levers. In particular around your service providers, in particular internally with your board of trustees, to ensuring you're a strong, driving a strong board of consensus around what needs to be done. And I think David mentioned this right at the beginning around the sponsor, and understanding that, what your sponsor's approach to understanding the risks and opportunities, particularly around climate change, but broadening that out, will have an impact, direct or indirect impact on the pension scheme. So I think it's that for me, it's a call out to the trustees. And as I started with a plug, I'll finish with a plug. Our toolkit is all free to access, and it's really very much designed for that trustee community to help drive that conversation with their internal and external audiences.
Another next step is to introduce more competition, and I never thought I would say this, but has the Pensions Regulator brought the Minsky moment to finance before the Bank of England? So reputation competition is also helpful. How can we accelerate each other by sort of besting our good ideas? So that's my final comment. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. So, Chris, I'll leave you with the final comments of this panel.
Thanks. No pressure at all. Well, look, a lot of what I was going to say has been touched upon, but in terms of next steps, what I think is really important for any investors is to understand not just what is the most green today, but what is going to be the most green in the future, because I think that aligns with a lot of customers' appetites. And actually, there is a difference between the two. Investing in something in an institution that might not be the most green today, but will be, particularly green in the future, actually facilitates the transition to net zero. Potentially in a greater way than investing in some institutions that already have funding and are green today. So I think building up the toolkit, building up the data in order to be able to identify how greenness is going to change over time, and then holding institutions to account for what they've said their trajectory is going to be, will be incredibly important. And also it will be incredibly important for just ensuring that greenwashing is reduced across the board. I think this is happening in a really positive way, particularly in the UK with the government's plans, but making sure that it's done well and it's done soon and it's done in a usable way will be very important. Yeah, I look forward to that, but I will stop there.
Thank you very much. Well, I'd just like to finish then by thanking you as our panel for your participation today. I'd like to thank all of our speakers from the webinar today, and also the audience for taking the time to join us and engaging with questions. So thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'll now hand over to David to close.
Thank you. Well, how do you summarize a discussion like that? I think we all knew that transition was difficult. It's difficult to predict what it's going to look like and the impacts that it's going to have. When you're trying to model it, I think we've learned that there are different ways of modeling it: the top down, bottom up, show different aspects to it, and I'm sure that the models will continue to develop. Let me just add my thanks to Udaibir and to Pierpaolo. Your in discussions with us were interesting, fruitful. We very much welcome your analysis, and I'm sure all the pension schemes will be interested to get their individual analysis back in due course. But I think your presentation has been a great scene setter in understanding how you've gone about looking at the impacts, not only in pension schemes, but across the entire financial sector. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for engaging with us as a regulator, and thank you for coming along today and presenting the findings. Chris, probably the fastest presentation of your approach that's been done. But thank you for coming along, being open and honest, and answering questions. Well, that's very much appreciated. And of course, Mike and Kerry for being part of the panel. As ever, your different perspectives, I think, are incredibly valuable. But also thank you to all those who provided data in the first place that made this whole exercise viable. I know it was a great ask of you to provide the detail of asset breakdown, but thank you very much for participating. Details of how you can look at this recording, look at the slides, will be out in due course, as well as the individual results. So thank you very much, everybody, for taking part. Thank you.